She entered the world silent, eyes wide open. One shimmered like rusted gold, the other dulled like ash rubbed into the earth. The midwife flinched when she lifted the baby to her mother's chest. The mother, Adeola, looked once and her face crumbled like stale bread. She turned away. "Cover her," she whispered hoarsely. The father didn't speak. He left the room and did not return for 3 days. Whispers began before the baby was named. They said her birth had chilled the air, that the crows had vanished from the trees, that the goat tied near the window refused to eat for 2 days after the child opened her eyes. The oldest women in the village, those with bones like twigs and mouths like dry wells, started telling stories again. Stories their own mothers had forbidden them to repeat. There was a girl once with mismatched eyes. The river dried up when she turned 5. The chickens laid eggs filled with dust. And the harvest shriveled though rain never ceased. Then one night she disappeared, and the next day the chief's son was found in the well, bloated and smiling. The elders of the village remembered more than most. They sat in the shrine house with stones in their laps, whispering of bloodlines and broken covenants, of ancient spirits who sometimes chose vessels to carry out old vengeance. The name they would not speak aloud was Iroba, the hunger beneath. It was said Iroba came once every 3rd generation, born through the mouth of a girl, but waking only when the village became too full of lies, secrets and sin. When Dami was finally named, 7 days later after 3 separate naming ceremonies failed, goats ran off, drums broke and the priest forgot his prayers. She was not cradled like a blessing. She was held up like a warning. Her mother gave her the name, Damalola, meaning bless me with wealth, but no one repeated it. The children her age did not play with her. Their parents warned them not to meet her eyes for too long. "You'll forget your own name," one said. "She's carrying silence inside her," another warned. "The kind that swallows voices." Dami grew up speaking less and listening more. She noticed how even the wind seemed to hesitate near her. How shadows grew longer around her feet. The animals avoided her, and even the village dogs barked when she passed. But she learned to move quietly, to take up as little space as possible, to stare at the ground so her eyes wouldn't scare anyone. Her mother grew thinner, quieter, always praying under her breath, always burning incense that never seemed to mask the stench of fear in the house. Her father built a shed behind the house, and though no one said it aloud, that was where Dami slept from the age of 5. But the nightmare started before that. She would wake in the middle of the night soaked in sweat, the taste of ash on her tongue. Sometimes her body would be covered in scratch marks, too thin to have been made by human nails. Sometimes in her sleep, her voice would murmur things in a language no one knew. One night, the neighbor's baby died. The same night, Dami had shouted in her sleep, "Take the small one now." By the time she was 8, the village had stopped pretending she was merely strange. The market women crossed themselves when she passed. Some men spat behind her. The chief's 3rd wife packed her bags and left entirely, whispering, "I've seen eyes like that before." Only one person watched her with something like affection. Her uncle, Mama's younger brother, Tay. He was a tall man with a limp and an obsession with old stories. He would bring her carved animals, bits of charcoal to draw with, and once, a book filled with riddles in Yoruba and Latin. He said, "Your eyes see what most people avoid. Use them." It was Tay who one day stood in the center of the village square, his voice loud and filled with thunder, and declared, "She is the final vessel. Sell her or doom us all." Dami had been 10. The villagers had frozen mid-step. Some cried. Some laughed in relief, because at last someone had named it. Others demanded he be punished for speaking curses aloud. But the priest came forward, trembling, and whispered, "He speaks truth. I've dreamt of her, with a mouth full of teeth not her own." After that day the way they looked at her changed entirely. They no longer pitied her. They feared her as they would fear a fire burning in the middle of their own rooms. Tay took her hand that evening and said, "I'm sorry, little one. But it's in your blood. My grandmother had the eyes too. But she killed herself before it woke in her." Dami didn't cry. She never cried. But she asked, "Sell me to who?" He looked away. "To someone who knows how to bind spirits." They took her 2 weeks later. The day before, her mother came to the shed with a bowl of soup and knelt beside her. She didn't say much. Only this, "I begged the gods to give me a son. But they sent you. And now I see you were never mine. You were always theirs." Dami stared into the soup. It tasted like river water. A covered cart came for her. No one in the village saw who drove it. No one asked. Some said it was the priest from the mountain shrine. Others said it was a foreigner who dealt in spirits. A few believed it was no one at all, that she vanished the way cursed ones do, leaving only her shadow behind. But Dammy remembered the journey. She remembered the silence of the cart, the way the sky turned purple at noon, the way even birds refused to fly overhead. She remembered the ache in her chest, the strange warmth in her rusted gold eye, how it pulsed like a heartbeat. And she remembered this thought, rising inside her like steam from boiling blood. They think they've gotten rid of me. But I am what they were always running from. That night, in the village, a child began to scream without stopping. The priest bled from the nose and died before dawn. And the goats, which had always avoided Dammy, lined up outside her shed and refused to move until the sun rose. But Dammy was already gone. They had sold her, thinking the curse would end. They didn't know curses don't end. They wait. And they return. They came to the house at first light, when the shadows still held breath and the dew hadn't dried from the crooked leaves that hung like gossip from every branch. The stranger's footsteps didn't make noise on the gravel path, though the rusted wheels of his cart squealed as if they bore pain, not weight. The merchant wore a long coat of snakeskin leather, the kind that shimmered even without sunlight, and over his mouth was a strip of woven silk, dark red, slick with something that looked like old blood. But it wasn't his silence that made the children scream from behind curtains. It was his teeth. They gleamed like sharpened silver in the low morning light, clicking softly every time he tilted his head. He brought no welcome, no reason, only a rustling sack tied with rope that smelled of crushed jasmine and old meat. Inside it they later found coins, enough gold to buy every cow in the valley twice over, but none of them could hold the pieces for long. Their palms blistered where the coins touched. One elder, greedy and quick to offer a prayer, kept 2 coins in his pouch. By dusk, his skin had peeled from the insides of his fingers, and the flies wouldn't leave him alone. He died 3 days later, muttering about eyes in the dark and teeth behind the walls. But that was after. When the stranger stood in front of Dammy's home, her father stepped forward with his head bowed and his wife hiding behind the doorframe. Neither looked at their daughter. The merchant did not ask for her name. He didn't ask her age nor her worth. He simply nodded once and held out the sack. Dammy, then 12, stood barefoot beside the old cooking stones, staring at the man whose face she could not see, and yet whose smile she could feel in her bones. She did not cry. She did not flinch. She walked forward as if she had been waiting her whole life for this moment, and perhaps she had. The coins clinked. The goats howled. And the village dogs, even the mangy ones that lived on bone scraps and nightmares, began to wail. When Dammy crossed the threshold of her house, the sunlight flickered like it had lost its nerve. Her feet left the red clay behind, and the wind rose without warning, curling around her legs as if to hold her back. But it didn't. It couldn't. She belonged to the stranger now. The cart creaked as she climbed into it. Dead crows, stiff and feather-matted, lined the floor in rows, their wings still partly open as if death had caught them mid-flight. The scent inside the cart was unbearable, a mix of incense, scorched feathers and something wet and sweet like spoiled fruit. But Dammy sat among the bodies without complaint. The merchant did not look at her, not directly. He only clicked his teeth together once, sharply. The cart rolled forward on its own. Behind them, her father watched until they disappeared around the bend in the earth. He didn't wave. Her mother didn't come outside. And Dammy never looked back. That night, something shifted in the air over the village. The sky clouded without rain. The river at the edge of the forest, the one with stories of its own, the one that swallowed a dozen children over the years, trembled. For one heartbeat it stopped flowing. The water stood still like glass, then reversed itself, sucking backward in a gasp before surging forward again, angry and confused. An owl flew upside down over the eastern trees. The fruit on the mango tree behind the shrine split open with no touch. And in the middle of the night, 3 of Dammy's cousins died in their sleep. The first was a girl of 15 who had once tied a rat by its tail and left it in Dammy's bed. Her mouth was found stretched wide open, her tongue snapped like a twig. The second was a boy who'd spat in Dammy's porridge as a dare. He was discovered kneeling by the window, face pressed into the sill, eyes glassy with the moon's reflection, yet the moon had not been out. The third, the youngest, had merely laughed too hard when someone called Dammy witch-born. He died curled like a baby, his hair turned white and his breath frozen in his throat. The village said the curse was leaving them, unburdening itself. The elders whispered prayers they had long forgotten. Someone painted a red X over the girl's old home, and another elder burned the ashes of her baby shoes. By morning a kind of peace settled, brittle, fearful peace. But the wise ones, the ones who remembered the first time the curse came, knew better. They did not sleep that night. And they did not speak the girl's name. Far beyond the village edge, the cart stopped for the first time beneath a sickle-shaped tree whose branches hissed without wind. The merchant stepped down and fed the tree something from a clay bowl. It steamed and hissed and smelled like blood and mint. Dammy watched him, but he still did not look at her. Instead, he reached into the folds of his coat and took out a glass vial shaped like a tooth. Inside was a swirling black liquid that pulsed like a heartbeat. He handed it to her. She took it without question. When she held it, it warmed in her palm and made her eyes sting. She blinked and the world shifted. The dead crows around her twitched. The grass hissed in a language she had never heard. The sky above twisted like a knot. And when she looked down at her own hands, they were glowing faintly, one gold, one ash gray like her eyes. The merchant finally turned to her. His voice when it came was not one voice but many, layered and echoing like drums under the sea. "You are not the end," he said. "You are the return." And then he smiled with all his silver teeth. He didn't tell her where they were going. But she knew. Somewhere ahead, the people who feared her most were building their lives on lies and forgetting the blood price they once paid. Somewhere there were names written on cursed parchment. Somewhere the old curse waited to be reclaimed. Dammy sat silently in the cart, holding the vial in one hand and a feather from a not-quite-dead crow in the other. Behind her, the world thought they were safe. But the curse had not died. It had been sold. And now it was riding back. The salt desert stretched out in every direction, pale and cracked like the belly of a dying god. The sun did not shine here, it peeled. It flayed. And the merchant, with his silver teeth and rotting honey stench, did not seem to mind. He walked ahead without pause, dragging Dammy behind him by a cord of red leather tied loosely to her wrist. She could have slipped free at any moment, but something deeper than fear kept her still. The ground itself hummed beneath her soles. The wind whispered in broken tongues. And ahead, crouched on the horizon like a beast waiting to pounce, was the house. It wasn't really a house, not like anything she'd ever seen. It was too low to be a temple, too wide to be a tomb. Its walls shimmered, not from paint or polish, but from something living, like the house breathed salt and exhaled shadow. There were no doors. No gate. No welcome. The merchant stopped a few paces from the structure and pressed a copper disc to the stone. A narrow crack split open, thin and vertical, no wider than a child's shoulder. He did not look at Dammy. He didn't need to. The house had already seen her. She stepped through, sideways like a crab, and the moment she passed the threshold, the crack sealed shut behind her with a hiss. Inside the air was thick and damp, though she could feel no moisture. It was the kind of damp that clung to bone, not skin. The walls pulsed faintly like veins under skin, their surface covered in tiny script too fast to read. She stood still for a long moment, waiting for her eyes to adjust, but the darkness did not soften. It only pressed harder. Footsteps approached. Bare feet on stone. Soft breathing. Then a hand reached out and took hers. The girl who held her hand was older, maybe 15, maybe 20. Her eyes were wide and empty, not from lack of light but from knowing too much of it. She didn't speak, only led Dammy down a twisting corridor where the walls curved like ribs, the floor sloped like a throat, and the ceiling disappeared into shadows. Dammy did not ask where they were going. Her tongue felt useless, heavy. Her thoughts were louder than any voice could be. At last, the girl stopped before a small arch, again not a door but a wound in the wall. She gestured for Dammy to enter. The room was barely large enough for her to lie down in. The walls were gray and cracked, inscribed with things that shimmered and vanished if she looked too long. In the center was a bed, if it could be called that, a slab of stone layered with thorns that somehow did not pierce the skin but scratched just enough to draw restless sleep. The girl left without a word. The room closed behind her. Dammy sat down and listened. That first night she did not sleep. Something was pacing beyond the wall, not on the other side of it but within it like a memory trapped between stones. It moved in uneven steps, sometimes crawling, sometimes thudding, sometimes laughing softly with a voice made of dust. The walls pulsed harder when it passed as if they resented holding it in. The house wanted her to speak. It sent her dreams woven into breath, faces behind the stone. It whispered promises, secrets, stories. It told her what it had done to the others, the girls who came before her, the ones who screamed too soon or too loud. It wanted her voice like a prize, a flare in the dark. But she clenched her jaw until her teeth hurt and stared at the ceiling that wasn't there. On the second day she was taken to a room full of other girls. Some braided hair. Some sat with arms crossed. A few rocked back and forth, eyes shut tight. None of them talked. There was no sound in the room except for breathing, shallow, slow, measured, like they'd trained themselves to become windless things. The eldest among them, a girl with cracked lips and missing fingernails, gestured to Dammy and pointed to the floor beside her. Dammy obeyed. She didn't need words to understand the rule. Speak and you lose your voice. Forever. They communicated with glances. A twitch of the nose meant hunger. A flick of the fingers meant danger. A shoulder turned halfway meant fear. Dammy learned fast. She was not new to silence. Her own village had taught her well, but here silence wasn't absence. It was rebellion. It was preservation. On the fourth night she awoke to find blood on her palms. Not hers. It glowed faintly and smelled like cloves and salt water. She wiped it away on the stone, but the walls drank it greedily. In return they gave her a name. Not her own. A different name older than language. It cracked against the bones in her ears and made her shiver. The house was naming her for itself. She did not accept. She began counting the turns of the corridors, mapping the house in her mind. She realized the place grew and shrank depending on what you believed. If you feared it, it closed. If you defied it, it opened. Her room expanded by inches each time she woke up without flinching. The thorns on her bed turned silver. The whispers became harsher, as if angry she was resisting. And the girls, they began to gather near her. They waited for her glances, mirrored her silences. One of them brought her a small stone carved with lines that shifted when touched. Another, trembling, laid a strand of her hair beside Dammy's bed. A third carved symbols into the walls of her own room, Dammy's symbols. They were choosing her. The house noticed. It began to groan at night, loud and aching. The walls spat salt. The corridors twisted faster than they should. One girl vanished. Another lost her hand, it simply turned to ash mid-prayer. But Dammy remained. She had not spoken. She had not screamed. And when the house tried to show her her parents' faces, pleading and terrified, begging for forgiveness, she blinked and turned away. That night, the pacing thing in the wall came closer than ever. It pressed its face through the stone, or maybe just the impression of a face. Two hollows where eyes should be, a grin of teeth that stretched wider than a mouth. It did not breathe. It did not blink. But it waited. She stared back, her mismatched eyes unflinching. You will speak, it said. They all do. But she only smiled, the corners of her mouth lifting like a quiet knife. Because in her silence she had found something stronger than fear. Stronger than the curse. Stronger even than the house itself. The thing in the wall growled, but the sound cracked halfway through. It backed away. For the first time the walls around her room did not pulse. They dimmed. They quieted. They bent. She was no longer its guest. She was its rival. And the house, the salt, the thing that once fed on girls' voices, they were all beginning to feel what she had known from the moment she was born. She was not the curse they sold. She was the curse awakened. She sat on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, back pressed against the wall that breathed behind her. The air in the room didn't move as normal air should. It pulsed as if from lungs buried deep inside the salt-drenched stone. At first she thought she imagined it. The murmurs. The sighs. The invisible shift in temperature when she opened her mouth to breathe. But by the third day she knew better. The house was alive. And it was hungry. There were no meals as she had once known. No bowls of yam porridge, no slices of plantain roasted brown at the edges. No stew, no rice, no meat. Only pain. That's what the others whispered when the veiled attendants passed by, dragging their buckets of gray water and leaving behind nothing that could be called nourishment. Cry and you'd get something to quiet the pain, a sip of warm broth, a hunk of spoiled bread. But if you didn't cry you went unnoticed. Starved. The other girls wept constantly. Some in great howling fits that shook their beds. Others in a silent, steady stream of tears that never seemed to stop. The attendants came to them with cloths soaked in iron, liquids that shimmered blue in the dark, bowls that steamed even when cold. Those girls looked pale but fed. Dammy watched them shrink and grow hollow in strange wrong ways. Their arms thinned, their necks drooped, but their eyes glowed too brightly. As if the house poured things into them other than food. But Dammy refused. She did not cry. Not when her bed of thorns tore her back bloody. Not when the walls laughed while she bled. Not when the whispers gathered behind her ears and told her that her name no longer belonged to her. She stayed silent. Her breath measured. Her heart slow. And that was when it began. The shadows. They came first as flickers, odd curls of darkness that darted along the corners of the room. Then they grew bolder. At night, they slithered across her bed, stopped beside her cheek and seemed to hum with longing. When she reached for one it didn't flee. Instead, it sank into her palm like smoke into soil. The first time it happened, her stomach twisted with cold. Her limbs trembled. But she felt full. Full in a way the others did not. That night, she dreamt of wolves made of glass. After that, the hunger left her. She didn't understand it fully, only that when the shadows came she opened her mouth just slightly, and they would slip in. Not like food. Like secrets. And as they passed into her, her body began to change. Her ash eye darkened. Not to brown like her mother's. Not even to black like the night sky. But to the black of still water over a deep pit, a kind of black that shimmered with weight. Her rust gold eye too began to alter. It pulsed when she looked at mirrors. She started seeing shapes behind her reflection. Quick movements, twisted faces, things that didn't belong. She stopped looking after a while. But the mirrors watched her anyway. One day, while smoothing the frayed blanket of her thorn bed, she felt something sharp underneath. A long splinter of bone. Yellow-white. Thin. But carved with something unmistakable. A sigil she had only ever seen in her village, the crest of her bloodline. A bird with its wings snapped backward, encircled by 3 crooked stars. The same crest her father wore on the hem of his ceremonial robe. The same one painted above the hearthstone in their family compound. Her hands went cold. She clutched the bone and turned it over, trying to find some mistake. Some sign she was wrong. But the truth hissed from the walls now. They hadn't just sold her. They had fed her to this place. Not as a trade. Not as an unfortunate goodbye. As a sacrifice. Something old, something vast, had once whispered into the ears of the village elders. Promised them safety. Promised them release from the bloodline curse that had haunted them for generations. The curse that always returned through a daughter. And they had agreed. A final vessel. But the thing they tried to rid themselves of didn't leave with her. It grew inside her. It fed with her. It learned her rhythms, curled its claws in the back of her silence, and waited. One night, a girl named Faye, with a missing ear and a hollow laugh, stumbled into Dammy's room. She was clutching her belly and crying so softly it sounded like music. "Please," she whispered. "Don't let the shadows eat me. I saw them crawl into your mouth. I saw them curl under your eyes." Dammy stared. She said nothing. Faye slumped against the wall. Her hands shook. "They say you're not like us. That you don't feed the way we do. That you taste different to this place. It likes you." Still Dammy said nothing. Faye turned her head slowly. "You're becoming it, aren't you? Not what they feared, but worse. You're becoming the thing they fear now." Dammy stood. Walked toward her. Slowly. Carefully. Faye didn't move. "I'm not afraid," she whispered. But she was. Dammy could see it under her skin, the way her pulse jumped in her throat. The way her fingers clutched the bone pendant at her neck. The way her eyes flicked toward the doorless crack in the wall, as if she hoped it would widen and let her flee. Dammy didn't touch her. She just reached out, and the shadow that curled behind Faye's head peeled away and slithered toward Dammy's outstretched hand. Faye screamed. Loud. Long. The attendants came running, their silver masks glinting, their silence worse than shouts. They dragged Faye out. She didn't return. That night Dammy did not sleep. She sat on her bed of thorns, bone clenched in her hand, and waited. The house spoke. It didn't use words. Not exactly. But it groaned, it wept, it laughed. And all of it was directed at her. She didn't fear it. Not anymore. In the morning she woke with blood in her mouth, not from pain but from change. Her teeth had sharpened at the edges. Her skin glowed faintly in the dark. Her shadow moved before she did. She was not what her family feared. She was what would make them afraid. And she was just beginning. She began tracing spirals into the dust with her smallest finger. At first, it seemed like a child's idle habit. Loops and circles in the dirt floor, meaningless patterns formed in silence. But the spirals deepened. They became sharper, more precise. They carried weight like grooves in bone. And Dammy didn't remember deciding to draw them. They just arrived through her hand. When she blinked, she saw them echo behind her eyelids. When she slept, they formed in her dreams, burning themselves into her breath. The other girls watched from a distance, whispering, but no one dared erase the marks. Even the shadows, once playful and flickering, began avoiding the spirals. They curved around them like water curves around stone. And sometimes, after Dammy had drawn for hours, the cracks in the salt walls would hum. Faint, like a voice trapped behind glass. Listening. At night, Dammy stopped pretending to sleep. The pacing creature outside her room had grown quieter, slower, almost reverent. Instead of growling, it would pause and then scratch once, a single drag of claws across the wall, like a question waiting for an answer. She still did not speak. But she hummed. It started with one note. Then another. Then a full melody rising out of her throat like smoke from an old fire. She didn't know where the song came from. It carried no words, only ache, the kind passed from mother to daughter when no one else is listening. The kind whispered into herbs and washed away with blood. Each night she hummed it louder. And each night she began to see things. It was always in fragments, never whole. A girl in a blue wrapper standing at the bottom of a well, holding her breath. Another girl running barefoot into fire, her face turned to the sky. A woman with Dammy's eyes kneeling beside a cradle, weeping into an infant's open mouth. Ghosts of her bloodline. Echoes of girls like her. Cursed, they said. Born wrong. Cast out. Buried. Drowned. Forgotten. Each vision carved itself into her like a memory. Not just seen, felt. She knew now why her body never felt like it was hers alone. Why her rust gold eye blinked when her heart didn't. Why her ash eye saw things before they happened. She was not the first. She was the last. The curse hadn't started with her, but it would end with her. Not in silence. Not in pain. It had never been a curse, not really. It was memory kept alive by women no one mourned. They called it a curse because it refused to die, because it survived despite centuries of being severed and silenced. Her family feared it not because it killed, but because it remembered. And now so did Dammy. The room grew colder. She touched the walls and heard voices layered beneath the stone, girls who never left, women who were made to disappear. They were not gone. They had only been waiting. That night she dreamt of her mother. But not the version she remembered, not the woman with the tight mouth and shaking hands who refused to hold her. No, this was her mother before fear took root. This woman smiled, sang, wrapped her in yellow cloth and danced under a storm. Dammy cried in the dream. And when she woke, a piece of something sharp and warm was in her palm. A tooth. She didn't know how it got there. But it pulsed. She placed it inside one of the spirals. The wall shifted. The ceiling groaned. The house breathed. In the room beside hers, a girl who had not spoken in weeks suddenly screamed, not in pain but with clarity. She remembered her name. In the hallway the cracks in the wall widened. The creature that had paced outside her door whimpered, then fled. The curse was rising. But this time it did not come to consume. It came to remind. Dammy sat cross-legged in the center of her room, spirals blooming around her like a forest floor. Her hair lifted in the still air, though there was no breeze. Her eyes glowed, one like molten coin, the other a dark eclipse. Her body vibrated with the weight of every girl who had ever been traded, silenced, sacrificed. They had buried her. But she was not soil. She was fire. Memory. Name. And she would not be buried again. The house had always made sounds, groans like something settling into its own bones, whispers like distant wind beneath the floor, the soft brushing of claws in places no eyes could follow. But on the 7th month the house began to scream. It started as a low moan, trembling through the salt-drenched stone at dawn. None of the girls spoke of it. They had learned not to speak of things that could hear. But all of them felt it. In their teeth. In their joints. In the thin skin of their eyelids. The sound did not belong to any creature they could name, it belonged to the house itself. And the house finally was in pain. That morning one of the girls, the quiet one with the cracked fingernails who braided everyone's hair, disappeared. She didn't scream. There was no blood. Only a single braid left behind, resting like an offering on the cold stones of the corridor. It was coiled, still damp from sweat, tied with a red thread that none of them had ever seen before. Dammy did not move when she saw it. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She simply sat down right there in the middle of the hallway and began to hum. The sound rose from her belly, deep and slow, like it had been waiting all this time just beneath her ribs. Her hum had changed over the months. It was no longer soft or searching. It was knowing. It wound itself into the air like smoke through broken thatch. The house listened. It had no choice. The walls began to bleed. Not blood, but salt water, thick, weeping rivulets that ran from the cracks like tears from eyes held shut too long. The salty air stung the girls' throats. Some of them coughed. Some dropped to their knees. Some crawled back into their rooms and tried to bury their heads beneath thorn quilts. But Dammy remained. Her hum did not waver. Then the doors appeared. Not real doors. Not carved from wood or stone. These were impossibilities, slits of space that opened in places where only blank wall had existed before. Like cracks in time shimmering. There were no handles. No hinges. Just light. Golden but thin. Wavering. One appeared before her. Just wide enough for a girl. Dammy stood finally. Her eyes were different now, one black as burnt bone, the other gold like coins soaked in rain. She didn't hesitate. She stepped through. No breath. No noise. Just the sensation of being pulled backward through her own shadow. And then she was there. Her old village. Not as it was when she left, but as it had been that last night, the moon hanging above the rooflines like a watching eye, the air thick with burnt yam and fireflies. She stood at the edge of the square. Her feet did not touch the dust. She cast no shadow. She was not part of this time. But she could see. She could feel. She wandered through the familiar alleys, past the hut with the clay drums her brother used to play, past the fig tree where the boys once tied up a goat and blamed her when it vanished. She felt no grief. Not now. Only clarity. She moved like breath through the dark. In the center of the village, the elders still sat outside their compound, talking in low voices, sipping from bowls of bitter roots. She leaned close. Their words burned. She was wrong. You could see it in her eyes. She walked without sound. That's not a girl, that's a sign. It's her mother's fault. That woman never bled after her birth. Something stayed behind. They sipped again. Do it quietly this time. The merchant comes next moon. No noise. Dammy smiled then. The first smile in 7 months. She turned away and walked the path to her old hut. The silence around her felt different, not empty but waiting. Her mother's hut still leaned to the left. The door still clicked when the wind touched it. The palm leaf mats still hung where they had always hung, curling at the corners. Inside her mother slept. Face turned to the wall, a scarf tied around her head, one hand twitching slightly in dream. There were no tears on her cheek. No restless turning. Just sleep. Deep, ordinary sleep. And then it came. A scratching. Soft, persistent. From the window. Dammy moved to the edge of the room and watched. The window, that small square hole carved into the mud brick wall, trembled under the sound. Something was outside. Not an animal. Not a person. Something. The kind of something that her people had stopped naming generations ago. The kind they'd only mentioned in riddles and warning proverbs. The sound was like claws on iron and breath through broken reeds. Her mother stirred but did not wake. Her hand moved to her chest. Her brow furrowed. Dammy watched the woman's mouth open slightly. A whisper. One word. Forgive. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was thick enough to carry. Dammy turned away. She had seen enough. The wound was old. And now it was clean. The door behind her, the one she'd entered through, opened again. But this time it did not lead back to the salt fortress. She stepped through. Now she stood in a version of the house she had never seen before. Not the one built of salt and screams, but one made of memories. Of consequences. She moved through room after room, watching echoes of the girls who had come before. One brushing her hair while whispering to a shadow in the corner. Another burying scraps of bone beneath the floor. Another giving birth to a small thing that never cried, then placing it gently into the mouth of the wall. Dammy passed them all. At the end of the hall was a mirror. Her reflection stood still. The spiral mark glowed on her forehead. Her eyes stared back, not afraid, not unsure. She raised her hand. The reflection did too. And then it moved first. Dammy didn't flinch. Speak, her reflection said. Dammy opened her mouth. Nothing came. Speak, it repeated. She closed her eyes. Her humming returned, but this time it took shape. The tune split into words. The words wove into names. The names grew into sentences. And the sentence she finally spoke was not hers alone. It belonged to all the women buried in her bones. I remember you. The house answered. Every wall groaned. Every window split. Salt water burst from the seams like veins torn open. The girls in their rooms began to scream, not from fear but recognition. The kind of scream that comes when pain is finally named. When silence is broken. The walls pulsed. The thorns in her bed turned to feathers. The floors cracked and revealed steps, not downward but upward. Dammy did not run. She walked. Through the humming. Through the salt. Through the screaming. And at the very top of the house, where no girl had ever been allowed, she found a door made of bone. It was shaped like her, tall, thin, with one black eye and one gold. She knocked once. It opened inward. The room was empty. She stepped inside and the door vanished. But now for the first time she could see the stars. The salt clung to her skin like memory, bitter and fine. Dammy didn't blink as she crossed into the first field of her old village. Ash streaked her tangled hair, and her breath left her lips in slow curls of smoke, like a prayer unsaid. Her feet, blackened from desert heat and miles of silence, made no sound on the dirt path. Not a single villager noticed. No one looked up from their harvest. No one gasped. Not because they weren't watching, but because the girl who had been sold wasn't supposed to return. The curse they believed was over. The crops had bloomed for the first time in years. Rain arrived on time. Children played without falling sick. The river held its course like a tamed beast. A few whispered that their ancestors had finally forgiven them. Others believed Dami's sale had sealed their salvation. But none spoke her name. They had buried it with the deed. As she passed through the market square, goats shifted in their pens and refused to meet her gaze. A black dog howled and ran backwards, eyes wide. Only the crows followed her, silent, perched on every roof like sentries. The villagers felt something wrong in the air, though they couldn't name it. A sharpness. A waiting. Dami's shadow stretched longer than it should have. It moved when she didn't. It slid ahead of her like it knew the way. Past the well where girls used to fetch water. Past the elder's compound, where the uncle who had called her the final vessel now sat toothless, blind, humming to himself. He stopped suddenly as she passed, though he didn't see her. His mouth trembled open and he began to weep. She didn't stop walking. She passed the small temple, once painted white, now gray with disuse. A single bell hung from its rafters, unmoved by wind. This was where they had gathered. Where the merchant had stood, silver-toothed and rotting sweet. Where her mother had turned her face and her father had signed the deed in blood. They had laid her on the altar without rope. She hadn't resisted. They thought her silence meant obedience. It hadn't. It meant watching. The altar was cracked now. A hairline fracture ran through the center, like the stone itself had broken in guilt. Beyond the village edge, in the thicket where the woods turned cruel, the merchant's cart lay tipped on its side, swallowed by vines. The iron chains once used to bind were rusted. The wheels had sunk halfway into the earth. Something had tried to crawl out of the cart and failed, claw marks dragged down the wood like tears. No one dared move it, but no one dared burn it either. They left it there like a monument to something they didn't want to understand. Dami stood before it. She didn't touch it. She didn't need to. Something shifted in the leaves behind her, and the birds that had gone silent all day suddenly took flight, scattering like spilled secrets. The air grew still. No breeze, no rustle, no cry. The quiet didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a held breath. Waiting. Her ash eye shimmered like glass, her rust gold one glinting in the twilight. The shadows beneath the cart shuddered, not from wind but from recognition. She stepped back. From the temple came the low chime of the bell. Once, twice, 3 times. The villagers froze in their homes. Doors were shut. Lamps snuffed. Even the crying infant stopped mid-sob. It had begun. She did not knock on a single door. She did not call out a name. Her steps carried her back through the center of the village, past the new homes, past the elders who pretended not to feel their own hearts racing. She did not look behind her, though now, quietly with bare feet and wide eyes, the children had begun to follow her. They were not afraid. They didn't know what fear was, not yet. Only curiosity. Only wonder. At the edge of the field, Dami turned and looked at the sky. A single star blinked red. Her shadow paused behind her, then stepped forward and merged into her own. In that moment, the ground beneath her feet pulsed once, as if something old and buried deep had recognized its final name. The curse was no longer carried. It had no need for a host or a vessel or a willing sacrifice. It walked now, and it remembered every name. It began with her uncle. He was once the loudest voice in the village, his tongue sharp, always the first to call Dami an omen, a stain on their name. But one morning he woke and could not close his mouth. His tongue had turned green and thick, soft with decay. Moss, the healer whispered, weeping at the impossibility. Moss blooming where truth had once died. He tried to speak, but only a wet rustle came out, like leaves brushing against stone. Then it was her aunt. She had spat into Dami's food the night before the offering, hissing that evil eats evil. Now each time she coughed, a coin clattered from her mouth, thick old coins from another century rusted with blood, slick with guilt. She choked on them nightly, gagging on wealth that once bought silence. No one touched the coins. Not even the children. Her father followed next. The man who had written her name in the offering book in his own steady hand, now stared at walls like they were puzzles he couldn't solve. His words unraveled, syllables falling apart in his throat. He tried to call her name but couldn't remember what it sounded like. He'd mutter nonsense at the chickens, cry when the sky changed color, scream if he saw his own reflection in water. Sometimes he drew spirals in the dirt. Spirals like the ones Dammy used to trace in secret. They ran to the priest then as they always had. But the priest sat in his hut, robes soiled, face blank. His eyes had gone black. Not empty, just unreadable like ink that had spilled across a page. He had tried to reread the old scroll of Dammy's birth, the one that had once named her a child of wrong hour, born into wrong blood. But the scroll had burned in his hands. His eyes melted first. The rest of him stayed whole but hollow. The village could feel something breathing beneath the land. Dammy did not hide. She stood in the center of the square beneath the tree where goats were usually tied. She wore a plain dress, neither new nor torn. Her feet were bare, cracked. Her fingers were clean. But it was her eyes that silenced them, one bright as polished gold, the other glassy and black as morning water. She did not smile. She did not cry. She just opened her mouth. What came out was not her voice. It was wind, but not a wind anyone had ever felt. It didn't shake the trees or lift skirts. It sank. It pressed down. It screamed and whispered at once. It carried no sound, but every ear heard something. A lullaby they forgot. A scream they pretended not to hear. A name scratched into a wall that had been repainted 10 times. The wind carried memory. And not Dammy's alone. No, this wind was old. It held the names and pain of every girl who had been silenced by the village in the name of peace. Daughters buried under floorboards. Nieces burned under market stalls. Sisters who bled out in prayer rooms. They had called it tradition. But the wind knew better. It called it history. One by one the villagers fell to their knees. The old women first. Then the men. Then the children who didn't know why they were crying, only that they should. Dammy didn't move. Her hair lifted gently. Her hands remained by her sides. She did not command. She did not curse. She remembered. The square filled with salt, falling from the sky in flakes. Not snow. Not ash. Salt. The kind they used to purify wounds. The kind they poured into girls' mouths when they said too much. It covered everything now, the homes, the shrines, the altar steps. The people wept under it. From the wind came voices, hundreds maybe more. Some laughing, some keening, some just breathing. One whispered, asterisk, I was 12. Asterisk, another hissed, asterisk, they said I was born wrong. Asterisk, and one tiny voice, barely a whisper, sobbed, asterisk, I only ever wanted to dance. Asterisk. Dammy closed her mouth. The wind stopped. Only the sound of knees against dirt remained. The curse had never been vengeance. It had never needed revenge. It had needed to be seen. To be named. And now, as Dammy stood in the square, the truth buried for generations exhaled its last breath into the world. No one dared look her in the eye. She stepped past them, slow and sure, and none followed. She didn't need to speak. They would never forget her voice again. Because now it lived in the wind. In the dirt. In the salt. In the silence that would never feel clean again. Dammy had not spoken since the day she was sold. That day her voice had been locked away with her name, her body, her story. Not by silence but by force. By fire in her throat, by hands over her mouth, by rituals that pretended to be prayers but were really instructions. Asterisk, don't speak. Don't remember. Don't return, asterisk. But now, she stood in the center of the square, the wind coiling around her ankles like a hound that had found its scent again. And she opened her mouth. At first it wasn't words. It was a sound that tasted like rust and rain and blood scraped from a stone wall. It was the voice of a girl who had died without being mourned. The sound of a lullaby caught in the throat of someone drowning. Then the pitch shifted, cracked and surged like a wave breaking through glass. Villagers covered their ears. Children clung to their mothers. The dogs whimpered and ran. And then came the words. They weren't shouted. They weren't whispered. They were declared. Each syllable felt like a sentence. Each pause held a weight that split the air. The voice was many things at once. Old as the first sun, soft as a cradle song, sharp as a hunter's knife. A voice too wide for one mouth, too deep for one body. I was born beneath the crying moon, she said. And you said I carried sorrow in my bones. The wind stilled to listen. You burned sage over my mother's womb before I even opened my eyes. Someone gasped. An old woman dropped to her knees. You tied a black string around my ankle and whispered, asterisk, don't let her see too much. Asterisk, but I did. I saw everything. The priest sobbed in his blindness. You said I laughed like thunder and that thunder was a warning. So you told me not to laugh. When I did, you fed me ashes. You said a girl like me should not carry joy. Her voice swelled now. You sold me. You paid with my breath. You spilled salt in a circle and chanted asterisk, take her not us. Asterisk, and the thing you feared came, but not to take me. It came to watch, to listen, to follow. The villagers trembled. I remember the merchant's veil. I remember how none of you looked at me as I was led away. You stared at the ground. Except one, my cousin. He watched. And he smiled. A man in the crowd screamed and clutched his face. His eyes turned white. Blood poured from his ears. Dammy stepped forward. I remember the girls who came before me. You said they died of fever, of hunger, of madness. But it wasn't sickness that killed them. It was the hiding, it was you. She raised a hand and the wind howled through the trees again. I named them. Her voice grew soft, but each name cracked the earth beneath someone's feet. Ebony. A woman gasped and collapsed, her skin turning cold as clay. Chinello. A boy began to cough, feathers, black, rotting, wet. Ifioma. A roof beam split clean in two and crashed into the dirt beside the temple. Zubaida. A child fell, not dead, but dreamless, eyes open and blank as mirrors. The names kept coming. One by one. Old names. Forgotten names. Names that had been written once and then rubbed out with oils, sanded off wood, buried in unmarked graves behind homes. With each name, a shadow broke loose from someone in the crowd. The shadows wept. They wailed. But Dammy's face did not change. You begged gods to take your guilt away, she said. You thought silence was mercy. You called my voice a curse. But this curse speaks truth. This curse remembers. She turned to face her childhood home. The windows had been shuttered, the door chained. Her father, no longer able to speak, stood leaning against the wall, mouth moving without sound. You gave me away like rot, she said. But I was never the rot. I was the mirror. The sky darkened. No clouds. Just darkness, like dusk had fallen straight from the heavens and forgotten to check the hour. The wind was still again. No birds. No insects. No rustling of trees. Only her voice. For every girl you buried without a prayer, the ground will open. She raised both arms. The first grave split beneath the feet of her aunt. A slow crack, then a widening yawn. It didn't swallow her. It only opened, black and endless, wide enough to make her knees tremble. Another grave opened beneath the old herbalist, the one who'd once mixed obedience water for wayward daughters. A third opened near the market woman who told stories of cursed children while selling eggs. Grave after grave tore through the square like breathless sobs. They didn't swallow. They waited. They didn't scream. They listened. Because now the curse had a voice. And it was not Dammy alone. The wind shifted, and from it came the other voices. Girls of many ages, speaking in tongues half forgotten, in dialects their own mothers didn't teach. Some sang. Some wept. Some just breathed. They spoke of tiny betrayals. Of being told not to run. Not to question. Not to dream too loud. Of love withheld and shame handed down like necklaces. Of pain inherited like ritual. The villagers cried out. Some pleaded. Some tried to confess. Forgive us, someone begged. Dammy said nothing. Because forgiveness is not owed. Because silence cannot be paid back with a single tear. Because the graves had not closed yet. She turned back to the altar, the one where her name had been offered up in exchange for peace. The stone was cracked now. The bowl that once held oil was shattered. The symbols carved into its base flickered, trying to rewrite themselves, trying to forget. But memory had returned. Dammy's hair lifted in the wind again. Her eyes glowed faintly, not with rage but with knowing. She had become what they feared. Not a curse that kills, but a curse that reveals. She was not here to destroy. She was here to speak. And in her words, the silence they depended on died. You say sorry now, she said finally. Her voice was a whisper again, soft, quiet, but carried through every ear like thunder tucked in silk. But not for me. For yourselves. Someone wailed. A man tore his own shirt and rubbed his face in the dirt. A woman clutched a necklace and kissed it again and again, praying for a god that no longer listened. Dammy turned away. The graves remained open. The names hung in the air like stars at noon, visible only to those who looked hard enough. She didn't stay to explain. She had said what needed to be said. Let the village sit with the wind now. Let them eat only what grows in truth. Let them live where memory breathes through walls. Let every daughter born from now know her name will not be erased, because the air itself remembers. The curse had a voice, and it would never go quiet again. The sycamore stands taller than it ever did in life. No one knows how old it truly is, only that its bark turned black the same year the river forgot how to flow straight. It creaks when the wind moves through it, though there is no hollow to speak of. And yet the children say it breathes. Villagers who once threw stones at Dammy's window now teach their children to place offerings beneath the tree. A smooth pebble. A whisper. A single hair plucked in silence. They do not know what the right gift is, only that wrong ones are always taken. The old house where her mother wept has collapsed. Nothing grows on that soil. Her father's name is no longer spoken, not out of respect, but because his mouth was the first to go silent when she returned. His voice was pulled from him like thread, unraveling everything he thought he knew about daughters and debt. Near the village square stands a shrine. Small, unassuming, carved from glass that never catches the sun. On it, a name is etched by a hand no one admits to knowing. Dammy, Cursebreaker and Cursekeeper. The letters shimmer faintly at night, like breath on cold stone. Travelers hear stories before they ever see the village. They hear about the girl with two eyes that never matched, the one sold like cattle and returned like thunder. They hear about the night when the sky blinked and every liar choked on their own tongue. Some dismiss it. Others ride in any way, full of purpose or pride. They do not ride out. In the towns nearby, merchants speak of strange weather. The air grows cold when someone is beaten unjustly. The wind screams before a betrayal. In one village, a thief who took bread from a crying child burst into flame without smoke. The old ones say she is watching, not from above, from below, from within. Some whisper she walks still, barefoot and quiet, collecting tears that were never allowed to fall. Others say she became the tree itself, growing roots where her bones should have been buried, listening to the stories carried by insects and worms. Her body is no longer needed. Her memory is enough. In the dreams of those who still remember her name in shame, she appears not as a woman but as silence. Heavy. A stillness that makes breath feel wrong. In those dreams, the cursed girls, her sisters in shadow, stand behind her, their mouths open in a scream that never comes. No one wakes from those dreams smiling. Some don't wake at all. Every spring, the grass around the sycamore grows red for one night. Children gather early and braid garlands without flowers, laying them at the roots. They are taught to speak no words that day. Not because they fear, but because they remember. Silence here is sacred. Not absence. Presence. When the wind howls thrice and the owls fly backward, the elders light lamps in their windows and sleep on the floor. They say it is the time when unspoken truths walk. No one is allowed to lie on such nights. And if you do, your voice will never sound the same again. They do not call her cursed anymore. They call her balance. Judgment. The voice that was never supposed to speak but when it did, rewrote the language of fear. No one dares to cut the sycamore. Not even a branch for firewood. A boy who tried found his hands stained black for 7 days, unable to lift a spoon or pen. He starved while food surrounded him, and only healed after whispering a full apology to the tree. The bark flaked slightly that day, not in forgiveness but in acknowledgement. No one saw her die. No one buried her. Some say she stepped into the wind and never touched ground again. Others say the house without doors called her back. But most believe she didn't leave at all. She is simply quieter now. Deeper. One morning, a child born with ash in her hair and rust in her eye was left at the sycamore's base. No one claimed her. The villagers built her a cradle from salt and sand. She grew without parents but with many mothers, all women who once knelt when Dammy walked by. They say the child never cried, only listened. And when she laughs, which is rare, glass windows shake and old men fall to their knees without knowing why. She is not the curse. She is the answer the curse waited for. And the wind still listens.